Good evening and a warm welcome to the Castle. My name is Jonathan Clinch. I'm the University Senior Common Room Music Secretary, and I've been asked by Professor David Held, who's the Master of University College, to introduce this evening's Durham Castle lecture, which is very generously sponsored by Santander Universities. This is the second lecture of this year, and you can find the programme for the rest of the year on the University College website, the university website, and on various leaflets that have been distributed this evening. This week, the global spotlight is upon British music, as many institutions worldwide celebrate the centenary of the birth of the composer Benjamin Britten, arguably the finest composer of classical music this country has ever seen. Much has been said and written of Britten's legacy, and specifically his dedication to the highest standards, to young people, to music education generally. So in order to bring classical music to the widest possible audience, it's therefore extremely appropriate to welcome two experts on the music of Britain, in both senses of the word Britain, to discuss the future of classical music. As Durham University's Chancellor, Sir Thomas Allen needs very little introduction. He's one of the world's most prominent opera singers and directors, having made his Covent Garden debut in 1971, singing Donald in Benjamin Britten's Billy Budd. He will be interviewed tonight by Professor Jeremy Dibble of the Durham University Music Department. Through his research on 19th and 20th century British music, Professor Dibble has become one of the country's most influential musical scholars. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Sir Thomas Allen and Professor Jeremy Dibble.
Thomas, it's lovely to see you here tonight.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Just like
I hate these things, by the way. I'm really not used to them, so forgive me if I start shaving with it at any moment. I will do my best.
I think perhaps kicking off.
Right.
What I'd really like to ask you to start with is, what do you think, given this question about classical music, what do you think is the real essence of listening to and enjoying classical music that convinced you to pursue music as a career? Perhaps, you know, that you took an interest in it from what age? I mean, what can you say?
It would be it's actually quite difficult to answer that, but I was familiar with, the younger ones amongst you will have to forgive this, but this is a real Monty Python moment coming up any time now, in that I grew up at a time when there were many amateur performers around. There seemed to be, you know, falling out of the rafters, and my father, to supplement, I suppose, his rather meager wages, used to teach the piano to whomsoever might want to learn, myself included, somewhere down the line, when I was about 9. And on top of that, his music making involved a male voice choir. During the war, he had a dance band. There were about 3 or 4 of them. He played the piano, and then there was a fiddler and a double bass player. He enjoyed that music and the music of Charlie Kuntz and Billy Mayle and that kind of music. Yeah. And then when he got involved with the choirs, either male voice or the glee club that he had 12 miles away in Seaham, there was a need to practice for the various concerts that they had. So I would sit quietly in a corner of the 2 rooms that we had whilst the local bass came through, and my dad played for him for a whilst he did a little bit of Handel or Eric Coates, whatever it might be, and then disappeared out the back door, and then the tenor came through and he did his bit. And so that was how I became familiar with arias from Messiah, usually sung by my Uncle Jim, and so on and so forth. And that was my acquaintance with it. The first orchestra I heard, oddly enough, was in Newcastle. There's a place called Newcastle, and there's a rumour there's a university there too. Was in Newcastle at the City Hall, and there was the Leipzig Gewandhaus playing Beethoven and Wagner, Tannhäuser Overture, I remember. I forget everything else. I think it was somebody like Konvichny conducting, but I might be wrong.
So did you come to appreciate classical music through your parents then, really? I mean, was that
I suppose
the
so, but I didn't know it was classical music. It was just music.
Yeah.
And I also heard Bing Crosby and I suppose Vera Lynn and various people of that sort, and Kathleen Ferrier. I didn't hear a great deal of popular music of the time, and I heard less and less as time went by. There was a kind of proportionate understanding or appreciation of music that the more serious, I suppose, music I heard, the melodic music, the older music that I heard, the less and less I wanted to hear the new boy on the block who was Elvis Presley or Tommy Steele or whatever. And I never, as a result of that, I never really did begin to enjoy popular music, and I dare to say, even now, it's a struggle for me. But my grandchildren give me what for as a result of that. I know I'm in the wrong, but it's just the way I've been brought up.
Yeah. And so tell me a bit about how you were encouraged to sing, and
I didn't need any encouragement.
Durham had something to do with it.
Durham did, yes. I had a desire to learn the piano with my father, nobody else, just my dad. I was too shy to go anywhere else, so it was dead easy to come downstairs or come in from school, and Dad would give me a piano lesson right there, and then we'd watch the coronation or whatever, and it was that time. And then the point I was in the school, I was in the church choir and a school choir in the junior school, and moved on to the grammar school at Ryop. Where singing in a choir was the thing. You know, it was acceptable. There was no stigma attached to the fact that you played rugby in the morning and then did a choir practice in the evening. The two went hand in hand, and it wasn't a soppy or a sissy thing to do. And I rather like that. I rather miss that attitude towards music making that seems, to a degree at least, to have been lost for a while. So I played a lot of rugby and quite a lot of sport, and sang vigorously whenever I could, in the church choir, in a school choir, and then a point came, my voice having broken at a ridiculously early age, that I offered up a big blousy drinking song for a school concert when I was about 15, and it went well. And I was offered some singing lessons by my physics master, which sounds odd. I'm glad to say that my music master didn't offer me physics lessons, and I did rather better at music than I did at physics, and we continued in that manner casually during lunch hours at school once a week, something like that, and I would enter a local festival, and gradually it started to take over my life, really.
And then you came to see Hutchings?
I came here because I was a black sheep in a grammar school of boys who largely knew what they were going to do with their lives, and I was losing sight of that on a daily basis. So it was thought best that I come here and meet Arthur Hutchings, the professor of music, on Palace Green in the music school. And I met him and sang for him, and he made a few telephone calls on my behalf, and I went to London and studied music. It's as easy as that.
But then, perhaps I could ask you, do you think that a young person in such a position as you were in, back in the early 50s, could do such a thing now?
Yes, I do. I tell you what I'm encouraged by. About 17 or 18 years ago, we set up an organization which we called at the time Samling Foundation. And Samling is an old Norse word. It's a gathering, you know, as in Sammlung in German, the Samling gathering. So we gathered together over in the Lake District 17 or 18 years ago, selected half a dozen really promising singers, or as near half a dozen as we could find, and started to work with them over an intense period of a week. That was all. Living together for a week, breakfasting together and then starting work, seeing it right through to the day, so having dinner in the evening, talking about what we'd been doing, and then, trying to find something else to talk about as well. You can't live in a pressure cooker the entire time. That started all those years ago, and we've gone on doing that, giving classes, offering. It's a craft, really. I'm a very great believer in the fact that I've learned a craft of sorts. My voice has been trained and developed over a long period of time. I've learned a huge amount of business that will get me from that side of a platform to the other, sometimes tragically, sometimes comically. I know how to do it, and what a character is about. And I need to impart that information to a new generation, and that's what I find myself doing, and that's what I've been doing for quite some years now. And we continue to do that. And what is encouraging, getting around to your question, is that 2 years ago, or even less than 2 years ago, we founded an offshoot of Samling, the major Samling thing that we've been doing, which is something we call the Samling Academy, which is actually an ethereal thing. It's virtual. It's a virtual academy, and we made it known to the right people here in this university and in Newcastle and in several schools around and about the area, or that we were looking for singers, anybody that wanted to sing. And we carried out a series of auditions, and the very first time it happened, and it was at Sage Gateshead, over a period of 2 or 3 weekends, it clicked. It clicked immediately, and there was a recognition of something, a need for the young people who were out there wanting to take their desires further of singing. And I went this year, we put on a production of Albert Herring, which I missed, but a few weeks ago I was in Sage Gateshead, where there was just an evening of ensembles and solos and duets and what have you, given by some singers from about the age of 14 onwards, some in this university. And I was hugely encouraged by it. I was hugely encouraged by many aspects of it. The principal one being, I think, that there was such passion and such desire. Not only was the desire there, but the level of performance was really high. There was a young 14-year-old girl from a school in Hexham, I think, who had a natural ability, and all she wants to do is sing. There's another girl that I was very impressed with from here, no names, no pack drill, but there was real quality on that evening, and I was hugely impressed and very encouraged, and hope that, we've discovered something, we've tapped into something, and it's the way forward. And the other aspect of it that immediately registered, that was when we gave, in the course of our normal Samling, the sort of senior school work, if you like, I noticed on the Wednesday masterclass there was suddenly an element of very young people in the audience whom I'd not seen before, because there's a proportion of light-haired people in the audiences that I sing to. Lighter-haired people, rather like this. And it was very noticeable that the age group seemed to have come down to a degree, the overall age. And the same happened on the Saturday evening when we gave the concert. So that's very encouraging. I love that. I like the fact that, there's a 14-year-old girl in Hexham who wants to sing the repertoire of Hugo Wolf. Not yet, but, sometime down the line.
I was thinking on that same theme, for instance, there on television there are attempts to popularise singing by people like, Gareth Malone, what do you think of this? Do you think this is productive, or
I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful, but I just have to say, it's nothing new. Yeah. People. It's some years now. Choral singing isn't what it used to be in areas like this, but it was rife. Every church had a choir that would do not just hymns and psalms, but the various oratorios that there were. So concerts were being given all the time. Every chapel had a choir. There were concert parties, there were choral societies, masses of them in particularly in industrial areas, because it was an outlet for so many people.
Yeah.
I'm glad. I mean, I'm thrilled that people are discovering the pleasure that there is in singing, either as soloists or in a choir, because apart from anything else, it brings folk together, but it's also very healthy for you. The whole business of breathing profoundly and regularly in order that you can produce large sounds because of a sustained voice is inevitably and invariably something that we will benefit from.
But do you think it's a successful agency for possibly drawing people towards classical music? This is something perhaps. Is classical music still in crisis now, or?
Yeah, but Jeremy, I sort of got sick over the years of feeling that we needed to go out and do evangelistic work on behalf of classical music. Classical music, or whatever classical music is, has been around for 500-600 years. It's not going away. It survives, and whilst I think I enjoy showing and demonstrating to people what a kick I get out of it, and I hope that others will too when I do so. It sort of does survive. Its very existence and its very quality ensures that, I think.
So do you think that these questions that some people ask, oh, well, we have to make it relevant for today and so on, is really the point? Or do you think it's something that actually people have to go to, rather than people always having to bring it to audiences to try and appreciate?
I don't know which way to think of that one. I think it works both ways. We've got out of the habit of just getting up off our backsides and going out to an event, and it's an amazing experience when you do. I think the actual effort of the physical effort of just getting there. And then coming away afterwards and discussing it, whatever it might be. I think there are huge things to be gained from all of that, aspects of that I think are very beneficial generally. But music, we could stop now and just do music. We could just have an event happening. It can happen. You can perform music wherever you want to, and I think that's something that is very interesting.
But I was thinking of, for example, you mentioned choral societies perhaps aren't quite what they were, and this was something that in many ways was a way of people getting to know the great works, for example, the Messiahs and Elijah.
Yes. Well, it was extraordinary. I mean, you could take for granted, but there's been that people would be familiar with those things. But there's been a diminution of learning of that sort or experience of that sort. I think gradually over many years we don't accumulate. There's too much out there. I mean, I can't remember what the date was when a person existed on this earth who had actually read all the books that did exist at that time. We clearly can't do that any longer. And I remember reading as part of research when I was preparing Don Giovanni, reading Don Juan of Byron, and largely not understanding very much of it at all. I mean, the depth and the thickness of classical reference within that is something that's beyond most people these days. Whereas one can only think that there must have been so many who could follow it entirely. That is no longer the case.
Do you regret that, or?
I think it's inevitable, really. I mean, we're just swamped with information the entire time. From the moment we wake up in the morning, there's no escape, So I think it's an inevitability, really.
Well, I mean, that brings me to a point about 10, 11 years ago. I remember, I think you probably said that you'd had more press coverage or press attention in that moment than you'd had in the rest of your singing career until that time at the Philharmonic Society.
Oh yes.
And
yes.
You had quite a lot of interesting things to say, quite radical things, I might say, in some ways. Well, they were. Well, they seemed to me they were. I was wondering.
Well, the Daily Mail thought they were.
Yes, they did.
I say no more. No, I will say more.
And I wonder whether you might like to you had quite a lot to say about PR engineers and.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could.
Well, there was no sour grapes about it at all. What I was saying was that I wasn't sure what world it was that we're moving into. I was fortunate to grow up and learn my work and learn my business in a generation that came out of a Second World War. So that this really is Monty Python-esque, so I do apologize. But it's true. So many of the people that I worked with, this year I celebrated having sung at Covent Garden for 40 odd years. And I remember when I started there, I used to look around at the various figures and characters I was working with, and they were enormously charismatic. They had stories to tell. My own agent at the time had been through a prisoner of war camp, which was an horrendous experience for him. And I used to look at him in awe, and it began there. And then the other people I was working with had all gone through wartime experiences. So you had a kind of awe for a lot of them. And I used to look at them and how they worked and the experience they brought to their work. And it was impressive. I was hugely impressed by so many of them. And there was a quality of singing amongst so many of them. And I had the opportunity to sing with some really, really great voices of the post-war years. Well, Joan Sutherland, Luciano Pavarotti, John Vickers, Nikolai Gyaurov, Boris Christoph, and I, it's rude of me not to remember all the others, but there were many.
My teens, I think.
Oh yeah, there were many. Alfredo Kraus, and
Yes.
they may well be names that don't mean anything to you, but they were major in their time, and they were hugely influential on my life and the way I regarded life. And then I just saw, and I would buy records as everyone did and listen to these people and learn from them. And then I saw, or rather, I think I read first, quite a number of years ago now, some statistics in one of the morning papers. And they related to record sales, classical record sales. Now, we'd got used by that time to being able to make another recording. Well, let's make another recording of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. How many are there? Well, there are 49 at the moment. Oh, we should have 50. How many recordings do we have of the rest of the Beethoven cycle? Oh, well, there are 75. Let's make a few more. And we got used to this idea of just being able to do this. And then suddenly someone said, some accountant said, how many units are being sold? And they looked at a conductor as great as Claudio Abbado, who had just, I think at that time, recorded Mahler symphonies, and there were compilations and selling. Around the world, I think the figures were 11,000 worldwide sold. And someone said, this doesn't make sense any longer. It hasn't made sense for a long time. We can't keep on doing this. And so it happened with the records of Neville Marriner and of Riccardo Muti and of Colin Davis and of Bernard Haitink, all these great conductors who had been accustomed to making record after record after record. And every summer I would be in one car or another going to a recording venue, doing an opera, then doing another one, another 2 weeks later. Year after year after year this happened. And these things sat on shelves gathering dust, not selling. And clearly something had to be done about it. So the record companies, those lovely record companies, devised a plot of discovering new talent. The girl in the school uniform who had the angelic voice, or the string quartet that could only play in the sea, it seemed. You wouldn't get away with it today because they were amplified and there were health and safety issues involved. I feared that they would be electrocuted at any moment. So never mind the fact that the great Amadeus Quartet had recorded all this repertoire. Now you needed it to be done on electronic violins and cellos and everything else. And it just seemed to deteriorate. And it was in orchestral music and in chamber music and in opera and in song and everything else. Now, clearly they had to keep themselves alive and keep themselves in business. And so they devised this way of doing by inventing this new category of starry, glitzy string quartets that had never been heard before. The idea, the concept. And similarly with, choir girls and little choir boys, whatever it might be. It was usually choir girls with aspirations to singing opera. Fine. But then be honest about it. Be honest about it and say, look, we're doing this because we need a different category. But don't sell it as the crossover work of someone who is a great, great singer, who will have a wonderful career on the stage and be a star opera singer. That isn't happening. That's not what it's about. And that's what I think is deceiving and wrong of them to do so, because it's a lie. Yeah. It's a lie. And I think probably everyone knows what I'm talking about, and names and everything else, but I'm not going to go there. I don't mind there being that category, but I just wish people would be honest about it.
Yes, yes.
Because there are, as I say, and I've known it, I've seen great young singers come through, Samling and various other things, for 18 years, but they don't have that same opportunity because they don't fit the bill or the category of this new invention that there is of the commercial approach to it.
Thank you. I mean, since you've become Chancellor of this university, what do you think the role of Chancellor, of musician, what a musician can bring to the role of Chancellor of Durham?
It's not an unfair question, because it's a question I've asked myself before I became Chancellor. I started asking myself that question right at the start of my career. What the hell good am I doing the world if I just go around singing a lot of loud notes in large theatre venues? And I think it's a problem for most singers. Maybe not tenors. Tenors are another category, and I'm well known as my thoughts and feelings about tenors. Right from the very start, I thought I don't, it's great. I have a lovely life. It's lovely to have this career. But what good am I actually doing? What am I contributing? And the fact I've lived on that sustained me more than anything else over many years has been that bit of correspondence that occasionally comes through the letterbox from someone who just says, I listened to, and it's usually 2 records I made a few years ago they were called Songs My Father Taught Me. And I've had more response to them than I think for anything else that I've ever done. Just a series of ballads, Edwardian and otherwise. And it's just that occasionally I receive a letter from someone who will say, my life was at a low ebb, and I listened to the sentiments of this song and the way you sang it, and it's helped me enormously. And just that is more helpful to me as an artist than almost anything else I've had. I think most people think that we're up there in the light with the makeup on and the big costumes and everything else and nursing applause and doing whatever, but that's not what it's about. It's not what it's about for me. I'm trying to do something up there, certainly, and it's great to have approval, but to receive a letter like that means more to me than anything else, and justifies me and makes me able to continue what I've been doing for rather a long time.
Well, let me continue on that theme then. I was wondering, what do you think the role of music is in a university like this? I mean, you've actually had some experience of that now, haven't you, in observing but also participating?
Yes. Well, I think I could turn that on the student body. I was knocked out, if you'll pardon the expression, when I came earlier this year, heavens, still this year, to sing Vaughan Williams and with the university orchestra and the university choir, and listening to a standard of playing and singing I honestly didn't expect. I just didn't know what to expect, though the Vice-Chancellor has told me often enough that it's excellent. And it certainly was that. And 2 weeks later, I remember passing through the cathedral, and there was the same orchestra being conducted yet again by Callum, took it, and they were then rehearsing Prokofiev and Shostakovich, if I remember. And I'm thinking, shouldn't you be doing exams? Shouldn't you be studying in a lab somewhere? That's the beauty of it, that it's balm, it's salve to us all. It's immensely soothing. It does have charms, undoubtedly, to soothe us, and it also allows us to have balance in our lives. I can't just do music. I don't have a lab in which I can, turn on a Bunsen burner any longer, but I do have a workshop in which I do and occupy a completely different part of my brain.
All right.
And I can work with wood, and I love doing that. I miss it when I'm not doing that. And then I have to switch off and go and start and study words and text and lines all over again. But I think that's the thing that music can give. If it's not the be-all and end-all of your life, it's an enormously helpful gift to have it there at your side when everything else is going on that is, in such a demanding life.
Yeah, I mean, I think but it's an enormously important part, I think, of the university. I would say that anyway, wouldn't I?
Well, I hope we all would as well. But I was walking with my family past Chad's. I was here in the summer on an off day, just quiet day, wandering around, and I went past Chad's, the chapel, and someone inside was playing a large grand piano very seriously indeed. And I stopped. I couldn't get in because it was one of those codes that nobody will tell me. I haven't graduated. I don't know whether I get one after a few years here, but
we can give you a swipe card.
I haven't got through those doors yet. But I listened long enough for myself to become an annoyance to the young man playing the piano. And finally, he came down to the door and said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, I'm the chancellor of the university, and I'm rather impressed at the way you play." And he said, "Oh, thank you very much." And it was seriously good. I don't know whether it was a big Prokofiev sonata. I didn't recognize it immediately, but it was big. It was big and dramatic. And I said, "Are you reading music?" No, I'm a physicist." So you may well know this young man, but there he was, not in his lab, but at this large grand piano, playing magnificently. I wish him well. I mean, there are so many good pianists around, but it was just terrific. I mean, that itself is what it's all about.
So generally, to come back again to this dreaded phrase, classical music, you feel pretty optimistic, I think.
In a place like this, it's wonderful, and also, the general activity of and involvement of so many people in so many things. I went to the Fringe this year and last year, and it never ceases to amaze me how many accomplishments there are and the level of accomplishment. Now, it's wonderful. It will survive because it's just there and it won't go away, and there are sufficient numbers of us that want to do it. What I don't like is that it's the polarization of it. There was a time when Neville Cardus would write one day about cricket, one day about a recital at the Halle.
Yeah.
Or Hans Keller would write about Schoenberg and then the Arsenal match. We don't have the Hans Kellers any longer, as far as I can see. And I think we do need people that cross those boundaries and can show us that you can cross the boundaries. It seems to me that there's an evil force out there somewhere trying to tell us that it's either one or the other, but not both. I might have that wrong, but there seems serious music and serious consideration of things seems to have been pushed into a very dark corner where it's hoped that it will just be swept away with the rest of the dust. And I think we're going to have to come out of that dark corner and fight, rather like a heavyweight boxer. I think it's time for culture, whatever you want to call it, has to stand up for itself and show that it can survive.
But do you think that's because there's been this shadow placed over it through the dreaded word elitism.
Oh, the dreaded word is such a wonderful word. I embrace elitism. We have to embrace elitism. But of course it's elitism. No one ever says that Manchester United is an elite football team. You're not allowed to say that. But they're doing better than others around here, and that's because they are an elite. And there's no denying that. But you can't use the word against footballers because they're the lads.
Yeah.
Well, the opera singers and the opera girls are the lads and the girls too. They're out there being elite, and so it should be. We shouldn't be interested in anything else but elite.
Who do you think
strive for the best?
Who do you think needs to do the fighting then?
Sunderland.
I was going to say Middlesbrough. Sorry, Hartlepool.
Who needs to do the fighting? Well, I think what we're coming to terms with is, I was saying earlier over dinner, the thing that we have difficulty with in this country is a gathering of people brought together for one specific purpose, to hear a concert, and then for someone at the end of it to say, now you've enjoyed this evening's concert, this concert will not be given ever again unless we can find the funding to make it work. Money. In March next year, I'm doing something for a friend of mine up in the wilds of Northumberland.
God's own country.
Yes, well, yes. And he runs a little festival up there, and he's asked if I would just go and say a few words, and what to say. Well, I've decided what I'm going to say. I'm going to walk into that church or the hall, wherever it might be, and just say over and over and over again, money, 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 money. You're here tonight because we need your money, otherwise we die. And there's no question of that, and we have to get used to this idea. We haven't been used to it for so long. We've been nursed, we've had a welfare system. There's been a regard for culture. Jenny Lee, God bless her, but it's been taken away from us. Gradually it's been eroded, and we're going to have to fight and learn how to fight and find that money in order that culture, that orchestras, that choirs, that theatre groups, that can all survive. There are lots of things that prevail against it, but there's no reason at all why we shouldn't just stand up and say, we have to have this, and if it means getting money, then we'll get money.
Yeah.
We'll fight for it. It deserves it.
And do you think we have to depend on more than politicians, or,
More than politicians? The plight of the political arena now, I think is just so appalling. It's the level that we're at the moment. I hope there's no politicians in here. Well, I don't care if there are. That we enjoy at the moment isn't wonderful, largely.
I would entirely agree.
And they daren't. I know a local politician here who has a deep knowledge of the symphonies of Shostakovich. He knows a huge amount about Monteverdi, a huge amount about the operas of Verdi, and so many others, and symphonic music on a vast scale. He daren't say so in North Tyneside. He'd never survive. It just isn't good. It doesn't capture votes, and it's just sad that we have to have this polarization, and that you become ostracized because of the assumption that if you like that, then you're not for us. You're not one of us. There was a group of people in the cathedral this afternoon, 240 children from Sunderland. I happened to bump into them, and I don't think that many of them, if any of them, had been in the cathedral before it had not been given to them. Now that's something that it's a place that's open. How they haven't made the long trek from Sunderland to Durham to see this place out of their own curiosity, I don't know. But we need to bring in people like that. We need so many people to feel comfortable about being in places like this. And it's all part and parcel of symptomatic of something that seems to be going on. That I just hope that the river doesn't, meet all the way around on one of these occasions, and we become isolated completely.
But do you think
this community in particular?
Do you think
I feel strongly
the
about
inculcation of this appreciation, is really in the children, you know, in primary school and so on, where the real seeds are sown?
There are great things that can start in primary schools. A few years ago, I got involved in something called the Halifax Learning Zone. And the man in charge of it was extraordinary. He was a man called Anthony Tippett. Amongst other things, he was a barrister. He was a rear admiral. He was M at one stage in his life and ran C&C Portsmouth and was education advisor to Thatcher. Don't want to go there. And sort of did the provisioning for the Falklands campaign. This is a man, and raised millions for Great Ormond Street Hospital. And then he got involved in this scheme in Yorkshire. And they asked me to go there and do a concert with school children. And I said, I can't see the point. I can see the point of my coming here on several occasions and getting to know the children, getting to know the schools, they getting to know me, and then we take it on from there. And we work together, and we sing together and perform together at the end of it all. And so we did that, and I went up to Halifax and the various schools around there on many occasions. And some of them were very difficult schools. One in particular had to be closed on one lunchtime because it was about to boil over completely. But there was one school I loved in particular. It was on the edge of a council estate. You went into it. It was very unpromising, but you went into it and something changed. There was a staircase that took you up to a room where there were some computers. And the children had free and easy access to the computers, and you could see that this was an exciting part of their life. Then you went along a wide corridor that had been narrowed because within the corridor, the headmaster had decided it was boring. And so he had a local team of carpenters build a Viking longship. And beyond that was a Tudor house, half-timbered house. And around the corner was a Pullman coach, a Pullman restaurant coach, beautifully made. And the children could go into all of them and study, read appropriate books or inappropriate books, I'm not sure, but they were familiar to them, and that's where they went, and it was all part and parcel of their life, and they were accustomed to it. And on the wall along this side, there was a Russian project, and the Russian alphabet was up there. There were Russian advertisements up there, and photographs of the Kremlin and St. Basil's Cathedral, all kinds of feasts for the eye. And I went into a little gymnasium area that they had, and the children sat around, and they said that they were going to sing for me. So they sang for me, and that was rather lovely, and they were about 10-year-olds. And I said, would you do that again? And they asked me about what I did. I said, well, I'm a singer. I'm an opera singer, largely, but I sing concerts and all sorts of things with big bands, called orchestras. Well, would you do something? I said, I will in a minute, but I want you to do something for me first. Would you run around the room and sing whilst you're running? And so they did that, and then they stopped. They got the end of their song, and they stopped. And I said, right, what you've just done was an opera. It's singing on the move, basically. And they liked the idea of that. And so I said, well, I'll sing something for you now. And I started out, I thought, what on earth am I going to do? So they were sitting in front of me, cross-legged on the floor, as one could at that age, for lengths of time. And I started out by singing, look, through the port comes the moonshiner straight, tips the guard's cutlass and silvers this nook, but will die in the dawning of Billy's last day. Aye, aye, all is up. So I sang them this whole Shana that lasts for about 8 minutes. I didn't tell them that it was by a difficult modern composer called Benjamin Britten. I didn't tell them it was about Billy Budd or the story or anything. I just looked at them whilst I was singing it, and they never moved. And the only other audience I've had like that was one in Prague listening to a Brahms requiem during the communist times.
Yes, I can well imagine. Yes.
And a level of concentration, the like of which one seldom sees except tonight. And it was amazing. And I said to them, what did you think about that at the end of it? Oh, so what happened? What happened to him? So I had to tell them a little bit about what happened to him. And then I went away again and went back 2 or 3 weeks later. And I said, hi, hello, how are you? Great, Tom, what should we do today? I said, I don't know, what would you like to do? Tell us about the sailor boy again. So I had to give them more Billy Budd. And there were no preconceived ideas. No one had got into their heads. They just listened to Benjamin Britten for the first time in their lives. These kids, most of them with single parents, living on a pretty rough council estate, absolutely fascinated. I mean, admittedly, I'm a brilliant deliverer of Billy Budd, but they were just hooked,
Yeah.
and they could be hooked if they're not to come under other influences for the rest of their lives as a result of that.
I wonder if this is one of the things. I mean, as you know, I've just written a book on Hamilton Harty.
Available at all good bookstores.
But you might remember in 1929 he organised this famous recording of Nymphs and Shepherds.
Oh yes, yes.
With
Yes.
the Halley Orchestra.
All dancing.
That's
Yes,
right.
yes.
And I think the play was made about it quite recently.
Nymphs and shepherds
That's right.
come
It sold
away.
over 1 million copies. And Harty always believed that, I mean, he admittedly didn't like jazz very much or much popular music, but he felt that he got those students to appreciate music at that age, and they sang, you know, the dream scene from Hansel and Gretel and some of these other famous parts, that he got them at that age. They'd appreciate it then for the rest of their lives.
Yeah,
And the truth is they largely did.
I think there are certain standout, iconic performances that if you were to ask someone, an old fogey like, well, say myself or yourself, and say, what would you recommend? I was in Dusseldorf last week working with some young people, singers in the opera studio there, and I said to them, I was trying to illustrate something about the brightness of the voice. This is a discussion for another time, but voices can do so many things. What you learn as a singer, what you become aware of as a singer, is how to use a voice, how to make it like a trumpet, or how to make it like an oboe, or a clarinet, or often a cello. I often liken it to a cello. And I was trying to explain that singing like a trumpet doesn't mean that it's blaring and brassy and harsh. It means that it really penetrates, rather than, the various qualities that there are. Excuse me, sorry about that. I have these things about 9 o'clock. And so I said, I tell you what, as an illustration of this, just, do any of you know the name John Charles Thomas? And they didn't. So, of course, I said, well, get out your iPhones, and of course they all did, and within moments we had John Charles Thomas in several recordings, and he's the man who's I'm as free as a bird, and it's this voice. You know immediately, it sends shivers down your spine, because it's a voice and a body that's just entirely open, full of sunshine. And when you hear that, as opposed to a voice that's singing Ave Maria, it hits you either in the solar plexus or in the nape of the neck, where it causes you to shiver because of the humanity of it and the physicality of it, the just sheer physical joy that's involved in singing, and you recognize it immediately. And if you hear that, and if you can identify that at an early stage, you'll never forget it. Never forget it. I always remember doing a concert many years ago of Berlioz's L'Enfance du Christ. And at the end of this piece, The Childhood of Christ, the person who is the narrator, the tenor, has to sing this very high, quite a high phrase in a particular kind of voice. And the narrator on this occasion was Peter Pears. We've talked about Benjamin Britten briefly. Well, here on comes Peter Pears. And I went to this first rehearsal. We may have prepared it with piano first, but this first rehearsal, and the chords went down, and a voice just sang. And I cried, and every time he sang it, I cried. And the mezzo-soprano alongside me also cried, because he knew exactly what he was doing. And it was a quality of voice that he was able to access that made you so uncomfortable. Or uncomfortable is not.
It's a very special form of French baritone singing, isn't it?
Well, yes, I mean, this is the Martin, but,
Yes.
but this was something else again, and it was just accessing a particular level of the voice and then knowing how to bewitch you with it, which is what was going on. And, you know, there have been moments like that occasionally, and I relish them. The things that one looks forward to, really, I think.
Well, on that note, I've perhaps got one more question before I hand over to the floor, and there's questions, I think, from the floor I've got here as well. In this Britain centenary year, you've sung a lot of Britain, and this is all about humanity in so many ways, different aspects of humanity. What do you think? I mean, you've sung Peter Grimes, and yes, you've sung in Billy Budd, Death in Venice.
Yes.
And
The Dream.
What would you say ultimately
Herring.
is the role that you have really relished? You'll probably say them all, I've no doubt. But
Well, it's easy. Well, it is a bit like them all, really, because I think they sort of go in decades. It's awful when you can talk about your life in decades and your working life at that. But there was certainly an early period in my life, and it maybe was 10 years, the first 10 years. And Billy Budd, I was fortunate enough to have that in my life for a long time, and it was enormously physically satisfying to play Billy Budd. But I don't think, in the overall view of things, it would have been the biggest accomplishment. I was very fortunate to sing Pelleas, which was a different kind of achievement, and Eugene Onegin, and then along came Don Giovanni, which remains, I think, the most mystifying one and the most satisfying one, perhaps with one exception, that of Beckmesser in Meistersinger. And Beckmesser in Meistersinger is the most complex of characters, and I, for a long time, didn't know what I would do with it, and finally based it on my mother, which is odd, really, but that's how it came out. But again, a gift of a role and an extraordinary piece of writing.
well, thank you very much, Sir Thomas. I've got one or two questions here from the floor, but I wonder also if there are. I've got here. When was your favourite performance, and what was your? Well, I've asked you what was your favourite role, perhaps already, but what was your favourite performance? Can you remember such a thing in all your experience?
Well, there are two incidents I do remember. When I was saying earlier that we don't, it's easy to think that the performers just love the bright lights and the cheers and applause at the end. In the early 70s, I was involved in a performance of Billy Budd at the Grand Theatre in Leeds. I was on tour with Welsh National Opera, and in the course of that tour we landed in Leeds and we had to give this performance, and it was like there was nothing to indicate there was anything different. We went on stage and started to perform, and something different happened. The chemistry, I really mean the chemistry, was somehow right that night, uniquely that night. And at the end of the performance, Captain, you may not know the piece. If you do, forgive me. But at the end of it all, you've gone full circle, and the captain of, not the Pinafore, the captain of the Indomitable is left on stage saying, I remember those days when I, Edward Fairfax Vere, commanded the Indomitable. And it just ends like that. And the lights go down, and Vere's just left thinking about what happened with the death of Billy Budd, and should he have saved him. And the lights went down, and no one applauded. And the silence went on and on and on. Maybe for 15 seconds, which doesn't sound like a lot, but actually when you're standing waiting, 15 seconds takes one hell of a time to tick over before someone dares to slowly put hands together, and then it starts. And Billy Budd is a cast full of boisterous men who've had 3 hours together, celebrating on board a ship and victory and battle and the French, down with the French, and everything, blah, 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 blah. 3 hours of that. At the end of all that boisterous behavior, we took our bows, and the tabs came in, and we all just left the stage quietly. And I've never experienced anything quite like that. The obverse of that is the build-up to the performances we gave in Covent Garden of Meistersinger, however many years ago it was. And it was an extraordinary process. I mean, I used to go into rehearsals right from day one and look at this thick score of Meistersinger, which lasts 3 days. It's very long.
You learn it.
And to think that this man had started with a pile of empty manuscript and written a text, written a libretto, set it to music day after day after day after day, and then we have to memorize it. It was a feat that astonished me in the first place. And then we started rehearsals quietly, 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon, sitting around discussing it. That went on for something like 3 or 4 weeks, these 3 huge acts. And that was in a studio. And then you move from the studio to the stage with a piano accompaniment. And, the few people that have been in that room, relatively few, then a few more added who wander around the theatre and look in occasionally and say, what's going on stage? And they say, oh, that looks interesting. And the buzz starts, and then the orchestra's introduced, and the buzz grows, and it gets bigger, and then you're leading towards a dress rehearsal, and the public comes in for the dress rehearsal, and suddenly there's a frisson around the place of thinking, my God, there's something special happening. And comes the first night, and it explodes, and that's amazing. And that first night of Meistersinger at Covent Garden a few years ago is something I'll never forget, because it was as though it involved the 2,000 people who were out there as well, the 2,300 people.
And I always feel to be involved in that second act with myself, when the riot then happens afterwards. I mean, it's one of the greatest moments in opera, really, isn't it?
Not when you're having heart attacks, but it is very exciting. And then the third act, which is just so immense, yes. The Festivisa and all of that stuff. And you come out with all of the parade and the pomp and the ceremony of it all. You look out there at the assembled crowds. Who are the audience? And you include those in the celebrations, and it's just extraordinary. It's why I do it.
I'm sure.
It makes it all worthwhile. And on that occasion, I must say, the cheers at the end were heartily earned and justified. I think it was unforgettable.
Wonderful. We're going to take some. Yes.
A second Mozart or Wagner? I think there may well be. Things have to move along. We can't live in a museum the entire time. But I'm not let me think. I mean, Addis is writing interesting things, I think. I know there's a project which I might well be involved in a couple of years' time, which could be very interesting based on a Buñuel film that could be fairly mammoth. There are, somebody like the German composer Aribert Reimann has been writing major works for a long time now. I mean, he's a man in his middle 70s, quite a young man. But there are those. You're not going to find, there won't be a Mozart necessarily, because I mean, we do move on. But you know, I love 12-tone music. I mean, I love modern music. I listen to, I try to keep abreast of what's going on and what's being written. I also like melodic music, and I love someone who can write a wonderful line. I mean, that was the beauty of Britain. He really did understand the voice and could write well for the voice.
You've got a composer who was so committed to the democratization of music in a way, you know, to young children as a written voice. You know, is there somebody around?
I'm sure there is. He did. I mean, and understood it very well. I mean, but maybe it was a zeitgeist thing, you know. Maybe it was a post-war thing of celebration of coronations and everything else, and children doing what children did very much at that time. And maybe we have to reflect the times in which we now live, rather than harking back and trying to drag that into the times now. I think that would be a mistake. I think it's time to look forward and see where we go with that. Like David Dimbleby.
Hi.
This, isn't it?
I don't really know much about classical music, but I do like music and I do like singing. To what extent can someone teach themselves how to sing well, and how would one go about doing that in the best way?
There's no hard and fast answer to that. There are those people, and I think I was one of them actually, who sang pretty naturally anyhow. I was born with a certain quality of voice that lended itself to giving music. What happens after that is the schooling of the voice and knowing how to use it, knowing how to stretch it and do the various things. It's like a physical exercise. It's like doing sport, basically. You know, I'm not equipped to do the long jump any longer or run 100 meters. But this thing in here, I know how to make that, allow that to survive for upwards of 5 hours if I need to. You know, a voice does get tired, and that's the training that's involved. But you don't start with a 5-hour opera. You start by doing the exercises and build up. But it's like anything else you do. I mean, if you wanted to do, I don't know, I like drawing, and I know my drawing improved after I went to a 3-week summer school at the Slade some years ago and just looked in a live class at the figure differently, and learned and looked at others and learned and watched how to do things and had instruction. Instruction, I think, from the right person, can always help and give you the right guide and keep you in the right line. I think that's essential at some point. Enjoy it for the time being, but if you want to take it further, get guidance. If you need help, I am here.
Yes,
I wanted to follow up on the earlier question to ask about new opera or composition of new opera. You mentioned a few names. I suppose I would be curious what you think would make a new opera succeed. Or for example, if you were hearing about a new opera, what about it would make you personally think, yes, I might be interested in seeing that, or I might like that? Like, what do you think? Or just your thoughts on this subject of sort of new composition of opera in the tradition, or drawing upon the tradition of the classical canon.
Well, there is a very an ideal case in point that I've pointed to with Thomas Addis, who is writing a new piece or preparing a new piece from absolute scratch, although it's influenced by a filmmaker. the whole thing has, you get an instinct for it, I think. The idea of the choice of film and the filmmaker and the subject matter is interesting in itself. I can't tell you what it is. And the fact that one knows about Tom Addison, what he writes and how he writes it, and his sense, just as with Britain, sense of theatricality, you make an educated guess and judgment as to what might be at the end of it. There's no guarantee. There's no guarantee at all. I mean, it might be an absolute flop, but you go along with it. You look at the various elements involved and make, as I say, the educated guess. I think it could be quite intriguing. It varies. I mean, for example, Birtwistle took Gawain as a subject some years ago, and I think it was a very powerful one, and it worked very well. The Tempest has been set to music recently. You know, I mean, so you've got a very good inkling of if you take Shakespeare, you've got a good piece of groundwork, a good foundation, anyhow. What you're going to get out of that, again, there's no guarantee, but the gamble's often worth taking. Andre Previn set Streetcar Named Desire some years ago, and quite successfully, I think. I think it worked terribly well. But you've got a powerful drama at the forefront of it, right from the word go, which is an enormous help. I think you look at the various elements involved. Sometimes it might be a story that's being constructed out of thin air, but you look at the composer. I mean, John Caskin, for example, who is the guy that lives up in the Northumberland Fells, wrote a brilliant opera, very difficult opera some years ago, based on the golem, the whole legend of the golem, that will survive. I think it will, you know, as many operas don't survive, and many musical works don't survive, at least beyond first performance. The second performance, rather like the second novel, is always difficult to bring off. That one has had more than one or two performances, so that's something to be said about it. I think one looks at the various elements involved, and then you make, as I say, the educated guess and think, well, time might be worth spent on that particular project.
This follows on from the previous question to some extent, but we've been talking about Britain a lot this evening, and there's a big celebration of Britain at the moment. But would it be right to say that Britain's operas, and probably Death in Venice, is really the last British opera to enter the standard repertoire of being performed regularly and internationally, and that really since then, I mean, even the Birtwhistles, Tippets and so on, haven't really done that, and that's getting on for nearly 50 years now. Whereas if you look at, say, West End musicals, just by the cartload. Now, does that bother you, or does it surprise you, or is that just the nature of things?
I'm inclined to agree with you. I mean, it's arguable and debatable as to whether Death in Venice ever entered the standard repertoire. It's a problematical opera. It's better accepted now than it was initially, that's for sure. I mean, I remember being involved in it at the Metropolitan in New York some years back. And, you know, the question was, you need a ticket for tonight? Never mind a ticket, which row would you like? You know, it's one of those. And he produced a number of works like that. Death in Venice was one, and Owen Wingrave was another that didn't meet with universal approval. And it may be that it will take years for them to be fully assessed. Wingrave, I suspect, won't ever enter the mainstream. I think Death in Venice will, because it's dealing with the late part of his life in many ways, and a lot of philosophical issues that he debates and discusses and illustrates in a way that he didn't in quite the same way elsewhere. He's also brilliantly inventive in using the standard orthodox instruments of an orchestra and making it sound like a gamelan band. And that's really rather extraordinary how he was able to do that. And you would swear when you're up there doing it that you're being accompanied by an Indonesian visiting troupe. The man was nothing if not inventive. Since then, Addis is the one that seems to stick out in my mind. Bird Whistle I have a problem with, and Tippett I think will, other than Midsummer Marriage and King Priam, would be my guess, will never be universally accepted and lasting. I don't think the Knot Garden does it, and I don't think the Icebreak does it for me, which would be the other two to mention. But I think Priam and King Priam and Midsummer Marriage are major works. Midsummer Marriage perhaps mostly. But difficult. They're not easy for the audience, a new audience to accept. I think Priam more so because you're dealing with an obvious historical subject or mythological subject. Midsummer Marriage is something else again. It may be more problematical. Britain will survive, and there will be others. There are others, but you know, he's a huge figure whom we may not have fully acknowledged as yet. There are reservations always about Britain, and one could discuss that at length as to why that might be, whether it's his passivity during the war and escaping these shores, which some people hold against him, whether it's his homosexuality. It seems odd, but he did seem to be an icon and a figure for so many bête noirs, for so many people that, I mean, I remember in my own family saying, I'm doing Britain, oh, don't like Britain, don't like Britain. They couldn't give you a reason why, but he was the person they didn't like. Rather, as in earlier generations, Stravinsky, don't like Stravinsky. There was something of that about it. There was no rationale to it, but there's always somebody, oh, I adore him, don't like him. So you had to have these categories of adoring and hatefulness, and Britain seemed to be the one that came in for the dislike rather more than others.
Hello. I just want to say that, so you know that internet has been a great revolution, and in terms of, I mean, promoting things, and specifically classical music. And now you can actually watch like the Berliner Philharmonic performances live from your cozy, I mean, home. But I mean, my question is that if other medias like television and radio, that are still playing very important role in terms of advertising things. Have they done enough for classical music, and in order to make it more popular, specifically for youngsters and children?
No. I mean, other than the prom season, how often do you actually see an orchestral concert relayed on a terrestrial channel these days? It's no longer meat and drink or regular fare for anyone. It seems to have been removed from the schedules. People have won't embrace it any longer and seem to have become afraid of it. It's rather like, I don't know whether you listen to Radio 4, but there's a Poetry Now program on Radio 4, which is known in the business as Poetry Now Click. Poetry Now, put that off, don't want to hear poetry. And it's a terrific tragedy. But I do think that the program makers and such like, I just wish they would have the guts to make a stand. It's easy for me to say. I'm not looking at audience figures or anything like that, but I think it does warrant, you know, concerts do warrant being heard. Otherwise, I tell you what I do notice. When they take a vox pop of the books that are being bought and read at Christmas, you'll have a representative there. Naturally, there'll be politicians, there'll be newsreaders, there'll be weather girls, there'll be umpteen others. You won't find a local pianist, you won't find an opera singer, you won't find an opera director. We might find an opera director, but very few. That's where I think we almost have no profile at all across the media in many ways. And we're losing out, we really are losing out. The irony of it is that the quality of music that's produced in this country and the quality of musicians and artists that we produce in this country are extraordinary. but then we always were good when we had our backs against the wall. You know, in a tight situation, trust the Brits will come out with something. I wish we could just do it with everyone fighting for us and on our side, rather than feeling as though we're against the tide large parts of the time. I think television has really ducked out of many of the commitments it could have made towards major orchestras in this country. The Berlin Phil is well enough seen often enough in Germany, and the Vienna Philharmonic is never off television in Austria. We miss out.
There was a time when, you remember Previn with the LSA?
Yes, that's right. But Previn, of course, had his roll-neck sweater, as did the rest of the orchestra, and it was presented in a kind of way. He was charismatic. He was Andre Previn, who came out of Hollywood and was married to Mia Farrow. And, you know, so there was all kinds of stuff you could weave around that. But I'm not saying that you should marry Mia Farrow before we can get on television again, but it would, I think it needs a figurehead. I mean, Simon Rattle does a great job, you know, when he gets an opportunity, but he's abroad mostly. And you need widescreen television.
My question is a bit simpler. It's a little bit about what you could summarize it by saying what makes you get out of bed in the morning, but it refers to something you said, which I thought was very interesting. You said, when asked what really makes it worthwhile, you didn't refer to the intrinsic qualities of the music, the drama of the performances, the transcendent qualities of the operas, or the complexities of the emotions expressed through this great history of music. You said, it's the letter that came through the door and said to me, listening to that performance changed my life. So I was struck at that moment whether it was, as it were, the knowledge that something had changed something that was profound to you, or rather, was it the intrinsic value of the music that you've explored and dedicated yourself all your life that actually in the end was the most important thing to you? In other words, was it the external understanding that something had changed rather than the intrinsic motivation of the exploration of music and theatre, as it were?
Well, it's an interesting question, David. It just affirms one's own belief system, I think. I have faith in the music that I perform. I mean, some of it, you know, I've been fortunate, I think fortunate, in that a lot of my career has been spent performing the works of Mozart, who is undoubtedly one of history's, one of the world's great creations. I mean, a genius of boundless measure, and I just, it's wonderful. Undoubtedly, it's wonderful to perform Mozart. It's wonderful to study it, and not just Mozart. I mean, the operas of Mozart. And I made this point very strongly in directing Don Giovanni recently, that he should, you know, be there emblazoned Mozart's Don Giovanni with a libretto by Lorenzo da Ponte. And this combination, this work that involves me of learning text, understanding that text, not just what it means. And in translation, but understanding what's between the lines of text, the psychological and the hidden meanings of it all, if you like, is the thing that embraces me and involves me and intrigues me. And then at the end of all of that work, the simple outcome of that is that someone was touched, took the trouble to say those words, and that's all I want. Wonderful that the physical thrill of standing, and there is a terrific physical satisfaction of performing Don Giovanni or whatever it might be. You know, the whole process of singing can be enormously satisfying physically. So one gets all of that out of it. But then to have someone take the trouble to say, that little song that you sang on that recording really touched me and helped me. I genuinely mean that. That's really what I look for. Or not what I look for, but it's a very heartening result. I can only say that.
No, it's a familiar thing to those of us who teach and who write in all sorts of different ways in this room. You know, you may come across someone 15 years later who you taught, who said, that lecture you gave, and you might have thought to yourself, well, that was a very humdrum lecture, but that lecture you gave made me change the course of what I did, you know.
And I think
that comes always to me as a surprise.
I think what's interesting is that once, in my case, I'm talking about an enormously large concept at times. You know, in New York, I'm talking about reaching 4,000 people in that house there, which is an enormous theater, and it's a huge space. And then you distill it all. I'm back to the laboratory. You distill it all down to that one moment some weeks later when a letter arrives, and it's like, I don't know, it's like the essence of a very good sauce. You know, that's it. That's all I need. Thank you.
Is there a work, or maybe an opera specifically, from whatever period that you know that isn't regularly performed and isn't mounted and isn't in the performing canon that you think should be?
Gosh, this calls on a great ignorance in my mind. I'm sure there is. I mean, it's not a great work, but a case in point would be the setting of Hamlet by Ambroise Thomas, which is seldom, if ever, performed. I remember singing it in 1980. And whilst it is regarded as the Hamlet with the happy end, it doesn't feel that way, I promise you, when you're looking down at Ophelia in the grave. But it's odd that there are those works that are neglected for whatever reason it might be. And there doesn't seem in most instances for there to be a reason. They just have been left on the side. I mean, for example, a few years ago, I sang the role of Gianni Schicchi for the first time. This is an opera that lasts maybe under an hour, and it's in real time, so that from the moment you enter, you just live the experience of being Gianni Schicchi and play this wonderful tiny excerpt from a canto of Dante in the next hour. It doesn't get performed anywhere near as much as it should do. It's a work of great genius, I think. And if it came back on a regular annual basis in my life, I'd be happy now until I decide not to sing any longer. And there are many others, and I can't think of anything in particular, other than something like The Hamlet, which I think is a fine work. There's great music. There's very good music in it. May not be great, but it's very good music.
Thank you.
You have spoken about, Sir Thomas, you've spoken about regional and local initiatives that you have taken to increase singers' possibilities on opera stages. I was just wondering if you have an opinion about the increasing popularity of opera in, for example, China, where they're building many theaters, and of course opera is an international business. And do you see a possibility maybe for British and hopefully European singers to go to China and see if there's a possibility there for exchange?
Oh, I think that's inevitable. In fact, it's happening. The regard for Western classical music my first experience was Korea and then Japan. China I'm not so familiar with, but it's amazing. My first visit to Japan was in 1979, and over the years since then it's been very interesting to see how it's grown. It's a very interesting phenomenon, I think, the whole thing. And I was in Düsseldorf last week working at the Robert Schumann Hochschule. And it seemed to me as if it was the Robert Schumann Hochschule of Beijing, because the vast majority of the students were indeed Chinese. And this need to absorb Western culture is a hugely big phenomenon, and an extraordinary phenomenon, I think, really. And it will happen. There is an interchange already happening with Chinese singers coming and Oriental singers in this part of the world, and the same will happen in reverse, and is happening in reverse. I just don't see myself ever singing Chinese opera. That's a transition I can't understand. I sometimes try to imagine what it must be like for someone who's never heard Western music and has grown up with the tonalities of Chinese opera or Chinese music, thinking, I think I want to sing Macbeth. How do you do that, for a start? It's quite extraordinary, and yet it is happening. I've seen it, and it is happening. What is interesting, further thing that's interesting about that, I was in Japan on one occasion with the radio on first thing in the morning in my bedroom, listening to a string quartet. One morning it would be a harp, and another morning it would be a string quartet. On this occasion it was a string quartet. And I was listening to it thinking, that's very good, it's good playing, it's good playing. It's very boring. Why is it boring? And there was no nuance. It was played exactly, it was written, but it was coming out like a computer, because the innate differences that we would make, having in our blood, in our DNA, a Western culture naturally there from birth, wasn't there, and that has to be learned. And in this particular instance, with this quartet, I didn't hear it. It was absolutely brilliantly played, as I say, very, very deftly played on the four instruments, but there was no nuance in it whatsoever. So heaven knows what the Viennese waltz would have sounded like had it been so undanceable.
Well, Sir Thomas, I think probably that's about all we can, we've got time for tonight, but all I can say is it's been a great privilege to interview you and to listen to you and to hear your thoughts about all these interesting subjects. And I would certainly, like to thank you on behalf of everybody here, and we hope to see you again soon. So thank you very much.
Thank you.